Thank you for logging on. I'm Sean Derns, Senior Research Analyst for Camera's DC office. Joining us today is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who will be speaking about the Iranian threat now. Regrettably, there is much to discuss. Jonathan is the Senior Vice President at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. Previously, he was a terrorism analyst for the U.S. Treasury Department. For those who don't know, Treasury plays a crucial part in the war on terrorism. Jonathan is a prolific writer and author with an output that puts me and many others to shame. Of particular note, he is one of a mere handful of analysts to have focused extensively on Palestinian politics, authoring two great books on the subject, State of Failure and Hamas vs. Fatah. I've read and highly recommend both. I also strongly recommend his most recent book, Gaza Conflict 2021, which is the first full-length look at the conflict which erupted in the spring of 2021 between Israel and Iran, a war which, I'm sorry to say, will not be the last conflict between Israel and the Islamic Republic and its proxies. Although Ukraine and Taiwan have been central to foreign policy discussions lately, Iran is once again returning to the front page. A new Iran deal seems to be taking shape after months of stalled negotiations between the Islamic Republic and the US over the former's illegal nuclear program. The backdrop for such a deal is also noteworthy. Iranian plots to assassinate former US officials, including John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and others, have been foiled. Iran has also been linked to attempts to murder journalists in Brooklyn, and of course, the stabbing of author Salman Rushdie in New York several weeks ago. And importantly, Iran's nuclear program has accelerated, and Tehran has ended its limited cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. Jonathan is here with us to discuss all of this and more. He'll speak now for about 25 to 35 minutes. Then we'll go to Q&A. If you run your cursor at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. Please click there and type your questions while he speaks. And with that, it is my privilege to turn this over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. It is a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to work with Camera. This is an organization that continues to do excellent work in exposing the systemic biases that we see in the American media and beyond. So thank you for all the work that you do, Sean. I've been asked today to kind of review the footprint of Iran, not only around the region, but around the world, a look at Iran's malign activities, to try to get a sense of what it is that we will effectively be funding if and when we see a return to the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal of 2015 that was disrupted by then President Donald Trump's exit. And now it appears that the Biden administration is intent upon a return. We'll start with the Rushdie attack because I think it was a jarring moment for many of us to see a revival of that 1989 fatwa. And this is, of course, a religious edict that was first issued by Ayatollah Khomeini, the founding supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you go back and look at that event, it was really a moment in which Iran announced itself internationally. Yes, you had the revolution began in 1979, and you had the hostage crisis, and then after that, one could even make the argument that Iran was taken off the board, so to speak. That from 1980 to 1988, it was engaged in a war with Iran that really tied it up. It tied its hands, and that it was only after the end of that war in 1989 that we began to see what the regime calls the export of the revolution. And ever since 1989, I think we can see a significant footprint. Back then in 89, we saw violent protests and demonstrations that were taking place all over Europe, places like Pakistan and India. Throughout the Arab world, people were protesting, and they were being spurred on by the regime, and there were fire bombings that took place, and booksellers were shutting down. They were removing the book from the shelves, and you could get a sense then of the long reach of Iran. Now, fast forward to today, and we continue to see threats by the regime against Western figures. This, of course, referring to John Bolton, the former national security advisor, Mike Pompeo, the former director for Central Intelligence, head of the CIA, even reporters like Masih Alinejad. This is an Iranian born reporter who's based in New York, and she was subject to a threat. But of course, even that's not new. A lot of people have made quite a bit about these threats or these foiled plots. But also, I think it's worth remembering that the Iranians were involved in a 2011 plot against the then Saudi ambassador to Washington, Adel al-Jubeir. And so, when we look now at what Iran is doing in the United States, it is obviously cause for concern. In recent years, the regime has actually issued names of individuals and entities which they have on their designation list. This is akin to what the Treasury puts out, the organization that I used to work for at OFAC, where we identify malign actors around the world that are involved in terrorism or proliferation, et cetera. The regime is now doing the same, except at the bottom of their designation notes, they actually make reference to the fact that it is legitimate for the security arm of the Islamic Republic to take whatever action is needed to neutralize these entities and individuals. And so we're watching very carefully right now the kind of impact that Iran can have in the United States. And that is no small matter, given that we don't really seem to have a definitive response. This administration has not drawn a so-called red line warning Iran of the consequences of such an attack. And I think, if anything, it looks right now, as we negotiate a nuclear deal that could yield the regime $275 billion in the first year, as well as $1 trillion over 10 years, it doesn't exactly amount to any deterrence. And it's that deterrence, that lack of deterrence, that I'm concerned about here in the United States. But I also think it's worth noting just regionally that there's a lack of deterrence, and we can see the Iranian regime really on the march. And so I want to take a few minutes today to look at what we're seeing around the region, the footprint of the regime. Now, I think I probably need to start the discussion with the headlines. And the headlines, of course, are coming out of Iraq right now, that we've seen several dozen people killed and several hundred people injured over the last couple of days as Iran-backed militias have made their presence felt, and they've challenged the power and the leadership of Muqtada al-Sadr, who himself, I think, has an interesting background, and he's, let's just say, he's tempered his approach to the United States and to Iraq in recent years. But the current headline suggests that it's the Iran-backed militias, what are known as Hashd al-Shabi or PMUs, Popular Mobilization Units. These are entities that are right now causing a lot of the havoc. Now, Iran has been destabilizing Iraq from the beginning. I mean, ever since the United States invaded Iraq back during the Bush administration, it's been Iran that has been at the forefront of stoking unrest. But certainly, as the United States has pivoted or started to pivot out of the Middle East, it has left a vacuum for Iran to fill. And I think Iran has seen this as an unfinished project. And the timing of this, I think, is crystal clear to anyone watching, that we're looking to pull out of the region. We're looking to try to end the discussion about Iran's nuclear program, whether or not it's satisfactory or not. And then Iran will have the ability to fill the vacuum that we leave as we try to pivot away from the Middle East. And so Iraq, I would say, is a key jurisdiction to watch in the months to come. This is an area, of course, where we've lost a lot of blood and treasure here in the United States. And it appears that we are about to fork over really an entire territory, which is significant, because this is obviously an oil-producing country, and it is a large territory that really has an impact on a lot of the rest of the Middle East. Now, in case you're trying to wonder what exactly Iran would like to do in Iraq, look no further than Lebanon. Lebanon is a country that Iran has had its tentacles in and around for the better part of 3 or even 4 decades. Right now, we can begin to see maybe not even begin, we can see the clear impact of Iran's influence in in Lebanon, rather. First, let's just look at the financials. The financials are staggering. The corruption and the sort of economic deterioration of this country is such that Lebanon is now in default of pretty much all of its obligations everywhere around the world. The estimate that I can give you here today, which is, I think, a low ball estimate, is that Lebanon is in debt to the tune of $130 billion. Now, that is an astounding number to say out loud. It's even more astounding to think that it was roughly half of that amounted to Argentina's debt when we saw Argentina default. And just to make it very clear, Lebanon is no Argentina. It's got no exports. It's got no industry. This is a country of 5 million people that depends on remittances from outside of Lebanon. And so I cannot imagine any scenario in which Lebanon is solvent in the next 10, 20, 30 years. This is the basket case of the Middle East, and it's actually quite worrying for other countries around the region, like Israel and Jordan, that they're going to be looking at something akin to Somalia on the Mediterranean. There's, of course, the political rot that has developed in the country as a result of Hezbollah becoming a legitimized political actor. They are the kingmaker in the region, which means that Iran is essentially the kingmaker, because Hezbollah is an entity that is owned and controlled by Iran. There is the military buildup, which I think it's possibly one of the more worrying features of this. It is now assessed by most intelligence agencies around the world, at least those that are worth their weight, that Hezbollah has a military that is stronger than most militaries in Europe. Okay, these are weapons that have been provided by Iran over the course of the last 20, 30 years. Their arsenal is about 150,000 rockets facing south at Israel. But more worryingly right now is actually a project that Iran has started since roughly 2014. And this is the provision of precision guided munitions, otherwise known as PGMs. Right now, we believe that Hezbollah has, let's say, roughly 500. I say roughly because it's not like they're going to Ernst & Young and settling up with their missile program every year. They don't need to come clean on it. But what we know is that they've been converting dumb rockets, unguided rockets, into guided ones. They've also been trying to import some of them by way of Iran through Iraq and Syria. And then in some cases, we now see precision guided munition production facilities that are based inside Lebanon. And the Israelis have tried to expose some of these facilities, but they're small. They can be shut down. They can be reopened rather quickly. And ultimately, Hezbollah's goal is to amass enough of these to be able to do real damage to Israel. What does that mean in practice? It means that PGMs can strike a given target within 10 to 15, maybe 20 yards. So, in reality, if you have Hezbollah targeting, for example, the nuclear facility in Dimona or the chemical plant in Haifa, and one of these precision weapons are able to get through and make a direct hit, you're looking at a mass casualty event. I think Hezbollah is also eyeing critical infrastructure, water, electricity, ways to do long-term damage to the Jewish state. And this is all happening, by the way, as the UN sort of is looking the other way with its hand in its pockets. The UNIFIL and other UN agencies have been completely unable to stop this activity. Now, I mentioned the PGMs traveling through Syria. Syria is another country that has been utterly eviscerated by Iran. It began, obviously, in 2011, 2012 with the Syrian civil war. The Iranians came in to try to save the Assad regime, and in the process, basically took control of the country. Assad still nominally is the leader, but in reality, Iran has created infrastructure throughout the country. It has IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard commanders stationed throughout. The Iranian military is there. The Hezbollah is there at the command of the IRGC. And we're seeing the proliferation of these PGMs, as I mentioned. It's the hub for the delivery of PGM parts and PGM units. But also we see the same sort of Shiite militias, these same PMUs that are active all over Iraq. They're active in Syria as well. And they are threatening Jordan. Not only Jordan, but Jordan is actually an interesting one. I was just in Jordan last week, and I had an opportunity to talk with a number of officials there. And they talk about how the PMUs are threatening from the north, that they actually also see the IRGC Navy in the Red Sea to the south. And so Jordan has been largely off limits by the Iranians, but one gets a sense that knowing that Jordan is a strategic asset to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, it's often been seen as sort of a buffer country, if you will, providing some time and space between radical elements and other key American allies. This is one of the reasons why Jordan has long been supported almost blindly here in the United States, and it gets wide support from Congress. You can now get a sense that perhaps Jordan is in the crosshairs of Iran, or at least Iran's proxies, and you can begin to see this is the goal here, just to be very clear, is hegemony for Iran. They are looking to be able to stretch and extend that influence throughout the region. Now, when I mention, I just mentioned the Red Sea. I think it's important also to note that yesterday there was news of the IRGC trying to capture an unmanned vessel that the United States has, that the Navy has in the Persian Gulf. This, of course, reminds us all of the incident on January 12th of 2016, where the Iranian Navy captured American soldiers and held them at gunpoint with their hands above their heads, forcing the United States to basically beg for their release. And so there is this battle that's happening on the high seas. It's not just in these various jurisdictions, but also in the waterways. And this is, of course, important because if Iran can disrupt the waterways, this is where the majority, certainly in the Persian Gulf, this is where the majority of oil is traded. This is the most important waterway for oil, right at a time when we're dealing with energy shortages and energy crises. Now, of course, when we look at this big picture of what Iran is trying to control around the region and what its target is, we need to talk about Israel. On that front, I'll just say this, that, there's a lot of talk about the various Palestinian groups that are fighting Israel. Specifically, we can look at Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Now, there's some debate about specifically whether Hamas is a proxy of Iran. This is semantics. And this is something that I talk about in my book, Gaza Conflict 2021. Hamas gets the majority of its cash from Iran. It gets the majority of its weapons from Iran. It gets almost all of its training, its military training, from Iran. Now, the Iranians are not able to dictate terms to Hamas in the same way that they do, for example, with Hezbollah. But their influence is vast. And even though Hamas has decision-making and leadership nodes in places like Turkey or Qatar or the West Bank or Lebanon, there are all these jurisdictions where we see Hamas figures that are operating, Malaysia, by the way, even as well. It is ultimately a significant chunk of influence that comes down from Iran. And so maybe they can't quite dictate terms, but the amount or the extent to which Hamas is influenced by Iran cannot be ignored. It's not quite what we saw this past, I guess it was back in July, that war that took place between Islamic Jihad and Israel. PIJ, as it's known, is a wholly owned subsidiary, not unlike that of Hezbollah. And so there are different grades, there are different sort of shades of colors, if you will, of the way in which Iran controls some of these proxies, but they are still proxies nonetheless. Even, by the way, the PFLP, for those who've been following this saga about the 6 charities that have been shut down by the Israelis associated with the PFLP in the West Bank. It's a little known fact, but the PFLP is also funded by Iran. I'll be very curious to learn if the Israelis do at some point release the declassified information about these charities. It'd be very interesting to learn whether there is Iranian involvement and whether that drove some of their decision-making to begin with. Now, one last thing I should just note about the regional component. I've talked about a lot of the different areas that are impacted by this. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Houthis. in Yemen. This is another terrorist group that is controlled by Iran, funded, trained by Iran. They're otherwise known as Ansar Allah. This is a group that's been responsible for war crimes, using human shields, enlisting children in their battle against the legitimate regime inside of Yemen. We've also seen attacks against the UAE and Saudi Arabia, including attacks against oil infrastructure. Again, that should be very clear at this point that Iran has the ability to flood the market with oil. It also has the ability to disrupt it significantly with the attacks that we have seen, or with attacks on waterways. So when you begin to look and kind of take a step back, you can begin to see the designs for hegemony and the ways in which Iran is slowly but surely creeping into the region. Of course, didn't even mention Saudi Arabia, where there's a Shiite population, or Bahrain, where there's a Shiite population. Just through people-to-people contacts and through minor provision of support, you can begin to see ways in which those countries have been destabilized by the regime in Tehran. Now, if that were not enough, right, when we look at all of this, then there is the long arm of Iran, where we have seen attacks such as the one against Amia, the Jewish community center in Argentina. That took place on July 18th of 1994. There was an attack on a bus in Bulgaria back in 2012, actually the same exact day on July 18th. We've seen attacks on dissidents of the regime all over the world. And of course, this is not only a phenomenon of the past, right? We're watching now as the Iranians are providing drones and other weaponry to the Russians in their war in Ukraine. So you can see these sort of how its interests align with malign actors like Russia. But also don't forget, it's not just Russia. We saw a deal that was signed between China and Iran back in March of 2021. This was a 25-year deal amounting to something in the order of $400 billion of assistance and trade that Iran would be enjoying with the likes of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm sure I'm forgetting some of the ways in which we see Iran destabilize the region and, in fact, the world. There is obviously good cause to describe it as the world's leading or most prolific state sponsor of terrorism. And I think that just often goes overlooked as we have been focusing, at least in recent months, on the possible revival of a nuclear deal. I'll just say here on the nuclear file, it was a huge mistake last time. It would be a huge mistake now. It was myopic in its view the last time around when we entered into the deal in 2015. It only looked at the nuclear file, and perhaps that was by design because there are too many other things to try to curb when we look at Iran's global footprint. However, what was the problem is that we were providing, and we're still talking about providing Iran with sanctions relief. The sanctions relief last time amounted to, at minimum, $150 billion, and that money trickled down to the proxies of the region, and that includes the Houthis and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and the popular mobilization units in Syria and Iraq. So what we are essentially doing is funding all of these actors that are destabilizing the region, sending the price of gas through the roof, putting our allies in peril, and for what? For a very fleeting constraint on Iran's nuclear program. This time around, it's actually going to be far worse than 150 billion. This time around, according to Saeed Ghassaminejad, who is FDD's resident economist, he estimates that we're looking at $275 billion. So nearly double what we saw last time around. And you could only imagine what that means for Iran's proxies. And by the way, even Iran's ability to repress its own people. This is only going to solidify the power and the reach of this regime. And if that's not bad enough, that 275 billion should be quite a number. It feels like a pretty solid smack to the jaw. But when Saeed looked further out into the future, he identified that it could be as much as $1 trillion by 10 years. $1 trillion that would go to the regime as a result of the sanctions relief negotiated in Vienna, and that we may be on the precipice of watching. The sunsets that were part of the 2015 deal In other words, the clauses that would ultimately dissipate in time. They are still the same as the 2015 deal. So last time around, you had a 5-year window and then an 8-year window and a 10-year window for various things. The 5-year was the arms embargo, 8 years was ballistic missiles. And then after that, other constraints on Iran's nuclear program would slowly melt away by years 10, 11, 12. What's interesting about this deal is that they haven't changed. They haven't extended those sunsets. So what was year 8 now, then, right, was 2023. That means it's next year. That's the end of the ballistic missile restrictions. Of course, you have to ask yourself, why would you put a restriction on ballistic missiles in the first place? Well, those are the delivery system for a nuclear weapon. And so that expires at the end of next year. You've got to wonder what it is that we're trying to actually constrain if we're not putting limits on what the ICBM delivery systems would look like for the regime. So there's a lot of there are a lot of technical issues that we could look at over the roughly half year that it would take to implement this deal. But I think sunsets remain a huge one. There also, by the way, is a carve out in this new deal, at least as we understand it, that would allow Iran to trade with Russia. So it would actually give Russia the ability to evade sanctions with the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism as part of this deal, even as the United States is working to impose sanctions on Russia for its illegal war in Ukraine. So a lot of logic is lacking here, and it's just extremely troubling to watch. Obviously, I'll just say this, that there's nothing wrong with diplomacy. We should be trying to solve all sorts of problems diplomatically. That should be part of America's foreign policy always. But it's really hard, I think, to negotiate without a credible threat of force, which this administration, unfortunately, has just simply neglected to wield. And as a result, and FTD's done a lot of work on this, we've seen that the year plus that President Biden has been in power, we've seen the most advances on the Iranian nuclear file. The Iranians have taken advantage of the fact that they don't feel threatened, they don't feel constrained, right? It's been quite a long time since that attack on Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. So they're beginning to think that, the Biden administration is not serious about deterrence. There is no credible threat, and so therefore they've been marching ahead. And right now we understand that they are probably weeks away from achieving a nuclear weapon should they wish to do so. Now, it's not all bad news. I've given you a lot of bad news today, and of course that's part of my job. I'm sort of that's all I seem to think about. We don't think about, what about this really positive possible development? My job is to look at the potential negative developments in the region around the world. But what I would say, though, is that there is one area where we've seen at least one actor pushing back, and that is, of course, Israel. Israel has been engaged in what it describes as in Hebrew, it's called Mabam, Milchama Ben HaMilchamot, the war between wars, or the campaign between wars, as they call it. And here we see the Israelis carrying out a range of asymmetric attacks against the Islamic Republic. We're talking about cyber attacks. We're talking about attacks in the maritime sphere. Attacks on the PGM smuggling networks inside Syria, attacks on the Shiite militias in Iraq and even Yemen, and even we've seen some attacks inside Iran itself. And it's actually really remarkable what the Israelis have been trying to do. They want to weaken that nuclear program. In some cases, it's just purely psychological warfare. In other cases, it's about the erosion of conventional threats. But it's been an ongoing thing, and really what it's done is it's shown the Arab world that Iran is not an 800-pound gorilla, that it has its vulnerabilities, that it has its weaknesses. And by the way, one of the regime's greatest weaknesses is that it does not have a particularly strong conventional military. It does extremely well in the asymmetric space, and the Israelis are fighting back in that asymmetric space. And I expect that if a deal is signed, we're only going to see an escalation of that war between wars. For two reasons. One is because there's going to be more cash flooding to the regime, and the Israelis are going to have to try to destroy as much of that as possible before it gets to their borders. So there will be, I think, a lot more unexplained explosions and things going boom in the middle of the night, and the Israelis may or may not claim credit for it. And by the way, the Israelis have claimed thousands of strikes, but there are thousands of other strikes that they have not claimed credit for. I don't even know what the number is, and I doubt that any of us will know, but I do believe that one day we'll look back on this war between wars as one of the more consequential conflicts in Israel's history, and it has gone almost entirely undocumented in our space. The war between wars is really a remarkable phenomenon. But the other thing that I think is worth watching here is that the war between wars could be, in fact, the platform for an Israeli attack in the future on Iran's nuclear capabilities. In other words, Israel is already seen by the international community as fighting this war. And by the way, it's not just one-sided. I mean, the Iranians are trying to attack Israel. They've been foiled just about every time they've tried, whether by cyber or by drone or by some other means. But it's this platform in which the Israelis are slugging it out. And it is seen as a defensive battle, right? It's legitimate in the eyes of the sort of legal scholars, those that kind of adjudicate what a legal war is, what a just war is. The Israelis are involved in this already. And what we could just begin to see that, that this escalates and that Iranian nuclear targets become part of the menu of what is struck within that war between wars. So I think I would just say that if we see a deal, expect an escalation to try to neutralize some of this. Now, of course, Israel can't do all of this alone. It's a huge problem for the Israelis, but by the way, it's a huge problem for the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and every other country that's been suffering from Iranian aggression and Iranian malign behavior. And there I have to say, and I'll end it here, regime change is kind of a dirty term or a dirty word in Washington. We don't talk about it anymore. That the experiments in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, have failed. That we don't do that well. And by the way, we don't. I mean, I would say that we can say that with some confidence that the U.S. is not particularly good at regime change, nor is it good at state building. But that doesn't mean that we can't find allies. We can't find the people on the ground that are truly opposed to this regime and truly want to see change. And my hope is that ultimately the answer to this is not Israel's war between wars, or it's not intervention on the U.S. part, but that this is that the solution would come from the Iranian people themselves. They are the ones who are the most afflicted, if you can believe it, after I've just described everything else. If it sounds miserable all around the region, it's even more miserable for those that are living at home in Iran and have to suffer under this regime. So it's my hope that they are the ones that are the solution to all of this and not external factors. I'll end it there, Sean, and I'm happy. It looks like I went about 35 minutes, so happy to take questions from you or from anyone else.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I think your final point there was extremely important. That it's the Iranian people who suffer the most. And this is also something to our advantage. The Islamic Republic has been around for only 4 decades. That's a speck in the long history of Iran, of Persia. So one question that we have is, how does the Biden administration's approach to Iran differ from the Obama administration's, not just JCPOA, but writ large?
I think it's essentially the same policy. One gets a sense that this administration came in and it was looking to, in their view, restore the only real foreign policy legacy of former President Barack Obama. I really can't point to much else that he did other than perhaps killing Osama bin Laden. In terms of major achievements around the region. And I think he saw this, and I think Democrats saw this as an achievement. I would, of course, respectfully beg to differ. I don't think it was an achievement at all. I think it was extremely dangerous and put the region at great risk, and I think it will probably do so again. But those that are negotiating this, those that are driving this process, right? I mean, we see people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Rob Malley. They got the band back together. to try to renegotiate this. They saw it as perhaps something, and I would say that this is probably also very similar to the Obama years. Hey, we have other problems that we need to tackle, right? Like China or Russia, for that matter. So let's, and this is how it was described. Let's put this problem in a box. Let's put the box on the shelf and let's close the door. Unfortunately, I think that's not how this is going to work. I think they would like to put all of this in the rear view, but I believe that, the sunsets, as we mentioned, are fleeting, and that you're going to be dealing with this nuclear challenge again in just a few short years. It's kicking the can down the road on sunsets. But then there's the broader problem, which is you flood this region with cash that Iran gets to disperse. And you see the rise of the Shiite militias and Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and the Houthis and, all these other malign actors that we talked about. The region will be set aflame. And if what you're trying to do is you're trying to get out of the region, the last thing you want to do is to empower Iran and let these actors run wild. And I think this was the blind spot of the Obama administration. I think it is the continued blind spot of the Biden administration. It's a mistake in either direction. The only thing that I would just note, of course, is that the deal that Biden is trying to negotiate here, at least according to the reports that we've seen, is worse than the one that that we saw the Obama team negotiate. It's more money. The sunsets are coming up quicker, and there's a carve out for Russia here. So you've got to ask yourself, what is it exactly that we're trying to achieve here, and will we achieve it? I'm not seeing the achievement. I'm only seeing risk. I don't quite get it. Now, some have said, by the way, well, this is what happens when, the Israelis were trying to urge Trump to pull out of the deal. And you could, I suppose, make that argument, but that doesn't mean that you have to get back into the same deal that you had with shorter sunsets and more money. It sounds like a different deal probably should be struck if you're not listening to your partners in the region, and they are unanimous, not just the Israelis, but the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Egyptians. They're all saying the same thing. This is not going to make us any safer. It looks like it's going to make us less safe. This seems to be the thing that the Obama administration missed last time, and it appears to be what the Biden administration is missing now. And I do believe that it's deliberate.
What if any obstacles are to its passage? One of the things I thought was interesting is there seems to be more House Democrats, for example, at this point that are expressing concern about the deal that's emerging. And then one thing that was one of the several things that's been memory hold several months back, well, I suppose longer than several months, Richard Nephew and several other negotiators resigned or were switched to a different unit in some cases. And the media didn't really cover that. But it seems to suggest to me that there's perhaps more dissent this time around, if not on the Hill, than even in some quarters of the bureaucracy. Do you think that's?
I think there is some. I think it's hard to quantify because you're not watching mass quittings, right? There's no great resignation within the State Department. People are sort of lifers over there. So you don't see a lot of people leave. You may see people getting reassigned. So there's been some real discomfort as it relates to how many concessions. Our understanding has been that that there's really been nothing where the Biden administration is held fast, that they continue to look for ways to appease so they can get the deal done and move on. So that's a huge problem. I do think that it's heartening to see that you've got House Democrats and those in the Senate also standing up and opposing this. INARA, the Iran Nuclear Accord Review Act, it's unclear whether that could get in the way of this at all. To me, it seems that perhaps if the regime takes its destabilizing activities maybe too far, a successful attack, one that actually kills an American, for example, where there's, direction from the IRGC, perhaps some of the violence that we're watching in Iraq, if it escalates, those are things that I would watch carefully. By the way, the near miss of having one of our unmanned maritime vessels fall into the hands of the IRGC, that's a significant, thing to watch as well. It almost looks, in my mind, like the regime is trying to see whether it can get us to quit on this deal. I mean, they keep doing things that are pushing us right to the edge, And right now, for whatever reason, the Biden administration continues to say, okay, fine, that was unprofessional, which is a word that drives me crazy. But we're going to still go ahead because this is in our interest. At what point does it not become our interest? I think that's kind of the big question that I would pose to the administration. I don't think we're getting many answers.
To follow up on that, one thing, and I'm sure this is the same for you, watching the news the last several weeks, I feel like I'm almost back in 2015 in terms of the leaks to the press and trying to set up an advantage in negotiations. So can you speak briefly about the role that leaks to the press play during negotiations?
It's funny. I find the reporting about these discussions, just as I did last time in 2015, just utterly boring. Okay, the U.S. has the draft that was provided to them by Iran. Okay, the Europeans have given their remarks. And there's a lot of this stuff flying around. What it does is it puts the spotlight on whoever is holding up the negotiations at that exact moment. And sometimes the occasional leak will give a sense of exactly, what the holdup is or why it's being held up. I have to say it's less than exciting. What we understand right now is that all sides want to deal. They're looking on the Western side to try to save face. I think on the Iranian side, they're looking to embarrass as much as possible. I think that is a strategy of theirs. This is about humiliation of the great Satan, if you will. And so, we continue to watch this dance. Again, what's shocking to me, amidst all the leaks and all the reports and everything else, what's shocking to me is that there is nothing that is deemed as too much or too far for this administration. They keep turning the other cheek. They keep taking it on the chin. And you've got to wonder, at what point are they going to say, will they ever say, that's enough? Too much terrorism, too much destabilizing activity, too much aggression in the region. We simply cannot abide by this. We can't give you this money in good faith. And by the way, there's the bigger question that looms over all of this, which is, is Iran even serious about non-proliferation? I think the answer to just about any realistic observer is, of course not. They're not serious about this in the least. They are maybe willing to postpone the development of a nuclear weapon by a few years in order to get a windfall. But I think ultimately they would like to create the ultimate weapon. Whether they want to use it on Israel or someone else is, I think, an open question. What's not an open question is what they would do with it beyond that, and that is they would use it as an umbrella, as a means to amplify their proxy attacks against Israel and all of our other allies in the region, with the knowledge now that you don't attack a nuclear powered country, right? This is kind of what we're watching in real time in Russia as it invaded Ukraine, right? If Russia wasn't nuclear, it would be, I think, parts of it would be a parking lot already. But because they are nuclear power, we have been extremely careful about what we say, what we provide to the Ukrainian army, and how we proceed with all of this. It's even just been a minefield just working through NATO. So you get a sense of, I think this has been an important lesson for the Iranian regime. They look at Russia and they say, we want to be like them. We can invade a country, we devastate a country, and we will know with certainty that there will be no ramifications because we're a nuclear power.
Or for that matter, Ukraine, which gave up its nuclear weapons 3 decades ago or so, and now we see what happened there. Could you discuss the Iranian threat to Judea and Samaria? And how does the press cover this threat to the extent it covers it at all?
They don't cover it. It's simply not covered. I mean, what I can say is that we've long seen the presence of organizations like Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. And of course, those are two entities that are funded and armed and trained by Iran. So by default, Iran is active in this space. The 2014 war between Hamas and Israel, I think, was probably very notable, given that it was the triple homicide of those teens in the West Bank that ultimately sparked the war. And that was an operation that was planned and coordinated and financed by Salah Harori, who is a guy that visits Iran quite often. In fact, he had a meeting with Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, I think 2 or 3 days ago. It was in widely reported in the Arabic press. So you get a sense of how Hamas works with the sort of Iranian axis. But fast forward to 2021, and I have a chapter about this in my book, which is over this shoulder, by the way. What we talk about in the book there is this notion of a nerve center that is purportedly based in Lebanon. Now, whether there is a building or whether it's, kind of a network of people that are operating there, and they don't necessarily have one geolocatable point. We can, I think, probably still debate some of that. But what's not debatable right now is that they are actively trying to coordinate with West Bankers and Israeli Arabs, for that matter. They were in part responsible for bringing people out into the streets during the last war, stoking that unrest, trying to actually provide some coordination to the activity that we saw in what the Israelis would call their mixed towns, the towns with Arabs and Jews living together. And more recently, we've seen a lot of Islamic Jihad activity in particular. And in fact, it's that Islamic Jihad activity that led to this most recent round of conflict. It was Bassem al-Sadi, who is a West Bank commander of the Islamic Jihad. He was arrested by the Israelis. The Israelis have been doing quite a lot recently to try to curb the unrest. There are two significant pockets of chaos right now in the West Bank. One is Jenin and the other one is Nablus. Those two towns are really what is grabbing the attention of the IDF and the Shin Bet. And they're doing their best to try to curb this. They're making a lot of arrests. For those of you who are on the IDF update list, if you're on WhatsApp, they have these constant updates. Almost every morning, I wake up to 2 or 3 of them. And if you look, there's just a ton of activity in the West Bank right now. Anyway, it was the arrest of Bassem al-Sadi that put Pidge on war footing. They were furious that he was arrested in the first place, and then the Israeli intelligence and military ops room on the southern front started to watch a lot of activity inside the Gaza Strip. It looked like they were about to launch an anti-tank missile against an Israeli school bus, among perhaps even some other plots. And that's when the Israelis started going after some of the senior commanders of the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. But it started in the West Bank. It started in the West Bank last time as well, right? You see a lot of this activity and it sort of spills over. Broadly speaking, I'll just say this, that Iran's strategy right now is it's actually a fascinating one. When you look at what they're supporting with Pidge and Hamas, what they want is they want relative calm in the Gaza Strip because it's already effectively an Iran-controlled entity. And what they would really like to do is to export this unrest to the West Bank, right? Because that's the territory that they don't control. And then once they have in their mind the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, well, that's when they can start to close in on Israel proper with help of the popular mobilization units in Syria, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. You've got, Israel surrounded on all sides. But the focus right now for these groups very clearly is to destabilize the West Bank and ultimately, in their mind, to see Hamas or some other Iranian entity gain control.
And it seems that they have an opening in the sense that Fatah is historically unpopular. Mahmoud Abbas is an octogenarian, smokes multiple packs a day, reportedly. Granted, his father lived to be 100, I understand.
Hey, he's vaping now. It's a lot healthier.
Mahmoud Abbas is vaping. That's a disturbing image, but I have it in my head now. So it seems that this is an opening of sorts for Iran's proxies to gain a foothold in Judea and Samaria.
It is, and I think they see it that way, and I think the situation continues to deteriorate. What I would just note here is that this is why the Israelis are in the West Bank on a regular basis. Everybody's saying they don't like it, but I have to guess that kind of privately behind closed doors, the PA probably understands that this is the only reason why they're still in business is because the IDF is actively purging Hamas and Islamic Jihad from this territory. So it's and it's really confusing right now. There is all this talk of Mahmoud Abbas going to the General Assembly in September and declaring Palestine to be the 194th country in the UN. It's kind of ironic because one of the criteria for statehood is that you control your own borders. And you've got these two pockets of unrest that it's only the Israelis who are able to settle this right now, or at least contain it. So I don't see the logic of 194. By the way, they call it Palestine 194 as the campaign. I would say in a little slice of good news, it appears that the Biden administration would agree with that assessment, and they have vowed to veto anything that gets put forward at the UN. So that's good. But yeah, it's really the Israelis are without them, I say the West Bank, I wouldn't say it falls overnight, but we watch the wrong actors gaining strength.
Right. And there's historical precedents for that in terms of the 1930s and other periods of internecine warfare. If you could talk a little bit more about Hezbollah, and not only you mentioned its very disturbing arsenal and its power, but also its use of human shields. We had the port blast some time ago, which was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Seems that Hezbollah is firmly ensconced amongst civilians, certainly in the south as well as in Beirut. And you mentioned the UN. I'm assuming that the UN isn't really doing much about that, despite there being several Security Council resolutions.
No, the UN's not doing a thing. UNIFIL, by the way, the UN international forces in Lebanon, they're going to be up for renewal in September. One of the things that we've actually seen recently is that there is an NGO that is called Green Without Borders. I certainly encourage folks to look them up, but they're a Hezbollah charity. I'll put charity in air quotes, right? But they are dropping these sort of trailer caravan type buildings all along the blue line. What they plan to do with it is not clear, but there is some potential military, implication here for what it is that they're doing right now. It appears to be, giving Hezbollah maybe a bit of a foothold. UNIFIL is not doing anything to stop this. Again, I mentioned the PGM construction. A lot of that is taking place, as you suggest, Sean, in workshops that are ensconced in civilian populations. That 150,000 rocket number that I mentioned, a lot of these are stored under homes, launch sites that are automated, that are either next to or under civilian infrastructure. So, what I think, we should all be aware of here right now is that if in fact there is a war that occurs between Hezbollah and Israel, and of course we've all been wondering when that next one would be. We're roughly 15 years overdue, give or take, because it used to be that it was somewhat constant and it's been extremely quiet. And during that time, Hezbollah has built up its arsenal to really, as I mentioned, they are on par with a lot of European militaries at this point. That's an extremely dangerous thing to say, let alone to consider here. So the next war will be a devastating one, because if the Israelis are able to, they will, of course, want to take out these arsenals. And if they are embedded and ensconced in these civilian areas, there will be a huge amount of civilian damage and casualties. And of course, I think Hezbollah is doing that by design. They want to make this war a painful proposition, not just in terms of the damage they can do to Israel, but also the damage that it will do to Israel, internationally and from a credibility standpoint. So it's a huge problem. For more reading on that, by the way, my colleague Ord Kitchery, who is a scholar on international law, he's done some good work on the issue of human shields. And of course, it's against the law in the United States. We have laws against it in the books. It's also unlawful internationally. At the UN, it's considered a war crime. So war crimes notwithstanding, Hezbollah is doing it anyway. And I suspect they're going to continue to.
And it's potentially devastation that could extend beyond the Middle East, in the sense that, as you discussed, Hezbollah operates in Europe. They operate in the United States. They've cased airports in New York City. They run tobacco smuggling rings in North Carolina, all sorts of nefarious activities, which I think shows their global reach. We can take one last question here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Why, in your opinion, is the administration interested in returning to the JCPOA? What's in it for the administration and for the U.S.?
Yeah,
from their
I mean,
vantage?
look, it's a tough question to answer because, again, as critics of the deal will tell you, there's very little that's positive in it. And so it does raise the question of why would you want to get into a deal that's this bad? It's going to reflect so poorly on the United States. I think when we look back, and it may be not even be a long time before we look back on it and say, God, that was a disaster. Again, though, I think that the same logic that we saw last time around, that we want to get out of the Middle East. I mean, I think the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have soured Americans on our involvement in the Middle East. Nobody wants another Middle East war, right? We're tired of watching wars play out in the region, watching our men and women in uniform come back injured or in body bags. We spent a huge amount of money in Iraq and got nothing to show for it. In fact, it looks like that investment is going to really be in peril now if Iranian militias do in fact assume greater control. So, I think Americans have soured on this, and then I think the policy community here in Washington is also soured on it. That increasingly you really can't, every day in this town you can't go you can't go a day without hearing about great power competition with China, trying to figure out how to counter Chinese, IP theft and their military rise and their control over international organizations. This is the new Cold War, if you will. This is the new paradigm, and it's extremely compelling, I think, to people that have been tired of fighting what are largely seen as tactical battles with the Taliban, right? I mean, the Taliban do not pose that kind of threat. Yes, they can potentially be the people that provide safe haven to Al Qaeda, but do they really pose a direct threat to to the United States? And the answer generally is no. They, with maybe some caveats. But at any rate, what you see is a similar approach to Iran. Like, this isn't our problem. We can get out of this. It's we don't have to deal with it directly. And it's part of, by the way, also a trend that we're seeing, and it's on both left and right. I have to be bipartisan here very clearly. What we would call neo-isolationism, this idea that it's just time to stop fighting any conflicts. Regardless of the ethics or morals involved, regardless of what it might mean for our friends and partners around the region. There is just a souring on involvement in the Middle East, a souring on interventions anywhere, and an intent to get back to that great power competition, which of course, that's that would appear anyway to be our bread and butter. We won the Cold War. We could probably do it again. I think there's a little bit of that kind of thinking in mind.
Right. And of course, we won the Cold War by having maintaining alliances and recognizing friend from foe.
Correct. And I think that is largely missing from the analysis, that you've got to create alliance structures. And at the end of the day, the world was divided. We spent a lot of time pulling countries out of the Soviet orbit and keeping them in our orbit. Right now, if anything, we see our allies looking and feeling like they're being spurned as we look to hightail it out of Afghanistan, hightail it out of Iran, Syria. It looks like we're leaving the region in the hands of actors that are actually more closely aligned with China and Russia.
Right. It's a very key point, I think. I'd like to thank Jonathan for joining us today. Iran's malevolent role is growing, and it's clear that it won't be going away anytime soon. I encourage you to check out his many works, where you'll find issues covered that the media too often ignores. Thank you to everyone for joining us and for your support of Camera. Please stay tuned for forthcoming webinars.